Welcome to Nevada and to the 2021 Art and Environment season. The Nevada Museum of Art has organized 5 exhibitions to serve as the backdrop for land art, past, present, futures. Gianfranco Gorgoni, Land Art Photographs, features 50 of this Italian photographer's most iconic images of earthworks in the American West. From Michael Heiser and Walter Di Maria to Nancy Holt and Robert Smithson, Gorgoni was on the ground in the late 1960s to help bring these projects to life. For nearly 2 decades, the Nevada Museum of Art has considered what is next for land art. We've collected archives and artworks for our permanent collection that look deeply at iconic earthworks. We've asked, who are the voices that have been left out of this dialogue? And what artists are critiquing the genre's most iconic artworks? We've worked with and commissioned artists who see land as part of a larger system. And we've acknowledged those who have known this and fought for this all along. Judy Chicago began making work in response to land art in the late 1960s. Her dry ice, fireworks, and atmospheres performances offered an alternative, ephemeral engagement with the land. The Nevada Museum of Art recently acquired this archive and is debuting it for the first time. The desert has always attracted mischief makers, those artists and dreamers who see and think differently, who aim to experiment in hopes of changing the world. High Desert Test Sites in Joshua Tree, California has offered artists this creative testing ground for over 2 decades. Rose B. Simpson's monumental earthen figures ascend from the gallery floor in her exhibition, The Four. Commissioned and recently acquired by the Nevada Museum of Art, their overwhelming presence reminds us all that land art and the land itself is more than just the earth beneath our feet. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our 9th talk in the 2021 Art and Environment season. My name is Ann Wolf, and I'm the Andrea and John C. Dean Family Chief Curator and Associate Director here at the Nevada Museum of Art. Today's conversation will be between Raven Chacon and Cannupa Hanska Luger, and it's titled Performing Land Towards an Indigenous Future. We begin by acknowledging today that the Nevada Museum of Art is located in the Great Basin on the occupied territories of Indigenous people. The state consists of 27 federally recognized tribes from 4 nations: the Numu, Northern Paiute, the Niue, Western Shoshone, the Washeshu, Washoe, and the Nuwu, Southern Paiute people. We acknowledge that more can be done to further research and integrate the stories of Indigenous peoples into the story of land art and to our collective knowledge of this place. And we're fortunate to call many of these artists and communities our friends, and so that we welcome them, those of them who are here with us today. I'd like to also welcome a special group that is joining us today, and that's our education cohort who is with us here in person at the Nevada Museum of Art. This is a group of K-12 educators who's meeting with Claire Munoz, our Charles Mathewson Director of Education, and they're working to translate the ideas and themes of the Art and Environment season into curriculum and lesson plans for students throughout the state of Nevada. So I got to meet them earlier today, and I'd like to welcome them to thank you for being with us. So it's my pleasure today to introduce 2 guests that are with us. I'll start with Raven. Raven Chacon is a composer, a performer, and an installation artist from Fort Defiance, Navajo Nation. As a solo artist, collaborator, or with Postcommodity, Chacon has exhibited or performed with the Whitney Biennial, at the Whitney Biennial, Documenta 14, Red Cat, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Montreal, the San Francisco Electronic Music Festival, Chaco Canyon, the 18th Biennial of Sydney, and the Kennedy Center. Every year, Chacon teaches 20 students to write string quartets for the Native American Composer Apprenticeship Project. He's the recipient of the United States Artist Fellowship in Music, the Creative Capital Award in Visual Arts, the Native Arts and Cultures Foundation Artist Fellowship, and the American Academy's Berlin Prize for Music Composition. He attended the California Institute of the Arts, where he received an MFA in music composition, and he lives in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I should mention that we first got to know Raven's work through his collaboration with the artist collective Postcommodity, and specifically the Repellent Fence project. And the Nevada Museum of Art recently acquired a suite of large format photographs from that project that are on view in the exhibition Land Art Expanding the Atlas currently. And so Raven, we look forward to hearing from you shortly and to hearing more about that particular project as well. Our second guest today is Cannupa Hanska Luger. Cannupa is a New Mexico-based multidisciplinary artist who uses social collaboration in response to timely and site-specific issues. He was raised on the Standing Rock Reservation in North Dakota, and he's of Mandan, Hidatsa, Anikara, Lakota, and European descent. Luger produces multi-pronged projects that take many forms through monumental installations that incorporate ceramics, video, sound, fiber, steel, new media technology, and repurposed materials. He interweaves performance and political action to communicate stories about 21st century indigeneity. His works provoke diverse audiences to engage with Indigenous peoples and values apart from the lens of colonial social structuring, and often presents a call to action to protect land from capitalist exploits. He combines critical cultural analysis with dedication and respect for the diverse materials, environments, and communities with which he engages. He holds a BFA in Studio Arts from the Institute of American Indian Arts. Cannupa, I was just looking back at some of our correspondence and our emails to see that you and I first started communicating about acquiring the archive of your Mirror Shield project from Standing Rock almost 3 years ago. I can't believe it's been that long. And I'm happy to say the materials from that archive are now on view and in our collection in the Land Art Expanding the Atlas exhibition. And I'd also like to share that rather than accepting payment for the purchase of that archive, the museum at Cannupa's suggestion made a contribution to the Kanaka Maoli people involved in the movement to protect Mauna Kea in present-day Hawaii. And so I look forward to hearing you talk a bit more about that the Mirror Shield project today. So before I pass it to Raven, I'd just like to remind everyone that please queue up your questions or comments in the chat or the Q&A. And so following a presentation by Raven and then one by Cannupa, we'll have an opportunity for Q&A from the audience. So I will go ahead and pass it over to Raven at this time, and then I'm going to share his images for him.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. And thank you, Nevada Museum of Art and Anne, for having us today and for exhibiting our work in this exhibition and including Indigenous voices and our perspectives on the lands we live on, and that we as well are guests upon, as this is a huge country that we're trapped inside of. So, so thank you again. And I'm going to show a few works from starting from the very first piece that I made and up to the most recent work that I've made, and cover a few of those. And some of those are with the collective Postcommodity that I was a part of for 10 years. And as Anne mentioned, the biggest piece we did, Repellent Fence, which has been labeled a land art sculpture, but also very much was a piece about collaboration amongst communities, binational communities. And so I'll start with this first work here. Is the earliest piece that I made, even before knowing that as a young musician and composer that sound art was such a thing. I was making these experiments out in the West Mesa of Albuquerque, where I lived and still live today. And before I play this clip, if anybody's listening on headphones, if you can maybe remove the headphones from your ear or put them at a distance from your ears, because what these are recordings that I would take with a small DAT recorder and a microphone and go to places that I knew of in the Southwest, places I've visited many times, places that I even have some family history with, and go to these places on quiet times of day, no airplanes in the sky, no cars driving down the freeway, no people around, no tourists, no wind even, and make a quiet recording of this place. And I would then go back to the studio and turn up the recording to its maximum. So if you can play this clip, this is Window Rock, Arizona, on the Navajo Nation. I did another one at the Sandia Mountains here in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Play that clip, please. And another one at Canyon Deshay on the Navajo Nation. This is very close to where I grew up. My work deals a lot with noise, but in those instances, it was not enough for me to just try to so-called capture a recording of the land. I wanted to magnify it. I wanted to hear it at its maximum. I wasn't listening to go to a place to meditate or to have a peaceful interaction with these places, as these places have become sites of violent histories. So I wanted to learn more and try to listen what was inside of these places. Years later, I got to go back to Canyon Deshay. I mean, I always go back. My grandparents still live there. But I was invited to actually do a commissioned piece at Canyon Deshay. And what I wanted to do was make some sculptures on the land that spoke to each other. And we can play this video and I can speak over it. What these are is 4 sound installations in the shape of electrical towers. And to me, these electrical towers look very much like Yay, or Yay gods, if you will, the creators, and a council of these beings speaking to each other on top of the hill. 2 of these sculptures, 2 of these Yays, are activated by the sun, so they're solar-powered oscillators. The other 2 are wind harps, and only speak when the wind is blowing at them. And so I wanted to have this these creators welcoming folks to the canyon Deshay, and reminding them of the stories around that site. Next slide. A lot of my work is collaborations. This is a piece I wanted to share today that I didn't do in the desert or in the Southwest, but also in a very vast environment of the Arctic, the Canadian Arctic. And so this is a work called Gauge. It was done in collaboration with multiple Canadian artists, Danny Osborne, Patrick Thompson, Alexa Hatanaka. Patrick and Alexa are muralists who have done a lot of work up in Arctic communities, Inuit communities, working with youth to make murals up there. Danny Osborne is a sculptor based in Canada and Ireland. Also on the team was Sarah McNair Landry and Eric McNair Landry and Eric Boomer, who give guided tours of the Arctic. Sometimes tourists want to go and ride a dog sled team. And so these folks are up there showing people around, but they also document, what is happening out on the ice, including the the climate change that they've witnessed in their lives living up there. And so the 6 of us, well, 7 of us, and when they brought me onto the team, what the idea was to paint murals onto shelves of ice out on the Arctic Ocean as the tide dropped and exposed these huge walls of ice. And if you can go to the next slide, the way that this was accomplished was by using natural pigments to not disturb any of the life that exists in the Arctic, and present these murals in layers on the ice. And as the tide rises back, it washes away these pigments. And so this is a piece that, of course, is a very ephemeral and temporary presentation, but part of my work was, and the team's work was, to present this as a video. So to capture time lapse of each mural being painted. And of course, where my work is concerned, capturing the sounds of that action amongst the Arctic wildlife, and as all of this appears and then disappears. So I think we made 10, maybe 12 murals over the course of 2 weeks. Next slide. And what this one is actually a sketch that Danny Osborne made of this particular ice wall. And then we went back another day and transposed the drawing back onto the ice. Next slide. But as such, most of my work is as a musician and composer. I've composed scores for folks who read Western notation. I also improvise and build instruments, and also coordinate different performances and facilitate any kind of music making that anybody might want to do. This is a piece I wrote a few years ago called Trumble Staves. And this was a piece where we wanted to, well, first of all, the composition process evolved after considering the movement of water in different bodies of water. So tributaries, distributaries, sounds, channels, as you're hearing these, some of these sound like sound terms. And so thinking of the dynamics of this movement and trying to incorporate that into a musical score, a notated musical score. And so in collaboration with these 2 musicians, who go by the name of the Living Earth Show, based in the San Francisco area, we put on a performance at the Sutro Baths. The Sutro Baths are basically a 20th century ruin, a symptom of economic failure, of greed, of trying to build a water park on the beach that everybody shares. And what Trumble Staves is now is a composition that can be performed anywhere, so long as it's performed near a body of water and near any kind of modern day ruins. And so the instruments for this piece include quarter tone guitar, a bathroom sink, a floating cello, dowsing rods, bird calls, amplified tile, stirred broken mirrors, an amplified fishing rod, homemade feedback ukulele, an oxygen tank, and a hammer, student guitarists, 13 percussionists, and a story and a narrator telling the story of that location. So if you could play this clip, please.
They say these be ruins.
As I mentioned before, I was part of a collective called Postcommodity, which was a collective of various Indigenous artists based in the Southwest and had a bit of a rotating membership. And for a lot of the early works, we were making a lot of different pieces in different forms. So sculptural, video, a lot of it involved sound. And all through that, we were doing these tests using these balloons, these objects that we had come across that were just completely fascinating to us. Next slide. These objects are these bird repellent products called scare-eye balloons. And these are 10-inch diameter balloons you can buy, as you can see here on I'm not going to promote this website, but the web, you can buy these online. And next slide, you put them in the tree and they're supposed to scare away so-called nuisance birds. And so Postcommodity had this idea, this kind of joke amongst us that if a 10-inch diameter balloon can scare away pigeons, that a 10-foot diameter balloon could ward off Western civilization. So we started making prototypes of these balloons with a balloon manufacturer and flying these at different contested spots. We flew one in Phoenix, Arizona, over the Sheriff's Department of Sheriff Joe Arpaio. Was very anti-immigrant stance, and it definitely did so when he was still sheriff. We also made one to fly in the Manitoba Hydro offices in Winnipeg, Manitoba, this being a corporation that manages the water resources for all of Canada. But ultimately, what we wanted to do was make a very large installation with a large number of these balloons. And this ended up in its very early stages being called the Repellent Fence. And if you go to the next slide, the idea behind the Repellent Fence was at first to be an interaction and an intervention with the US-Mexico border. Itself a man-made intervention into the borderlands that, as we saw it, of course, as Indigenous land of current Indigenous people, also detribalized people who now identify by the nation they're trapped in this case, Mexico or Mexican. And we wanted to then interrupt that border. And as the piece evolved, we started thinking, well, not only can it intervene, it can also intersect, and in its own intersection, show this corridor that had been used for centuries, millennia, of interaction between tribes that are based in Arizona, who have been able to still survive in Arizona, and those that live in Sonora, Mexico. And so over 7 years of researching and finding a place to do this project, were we able to stage this piece in Agua Prieta, Sonora, the sister cities of Agua Prieta and Douglas, Arizona, as you see there in the southeast corner of the map. And go to the next slide. And so we fabricated 28 of these balloons. And in working with the municipality of Douglas, Arizona, and the city across the border, Agua Prieta, were we able to bypass having to work with the federal government, having to work with private landowners, and this ended up becoming much more of a community collaboration than we anticipated. Continue to the next slide. And so what these are shots of us installing the Repellent Fence. This was back in 2015, October. One more slide. And we were able to fly these 26 tethered balloons at spanning a mile on the US side and a mile on the Mexico side at a height of 100 feet in the air. And what we like to refer to this installation as an ephemeral monument. And we also call it a reimagined ceremony, an opportunity to share stories on both sides of the border, to remind people of the history of that place, to remind people of who the people who live in that place are, who the tribe was that stewarded that place, And for us, it was very much a learning experience. Myself coming from the Navajo Nation in northern Arizona, was able to learn stories of the Opata and the Apache who had been traversing those areas, who had been battling both the US government and the Mexican government. And what is happening today as well? What is the management of those lands? What are the conflicts that are still occurring in these places? Continue on. And so these are more installation shots of the piece. To us, it was very important, as it gets referred to as a land art piece, to still leave no mark upon the place. As these were tethered with anchors, they were also easily deinstalled. We didn't want to disturb any of the wildlife that is there. And in doing so also, we worked with folks to install the piece, people who knew the area, people who are invested in the protection of that desert. There's a photo through the US-Mexico fence of the installation. And this is some school children who came to see the installation as it was up. One more slide. And this is, I think, a little Navajo boy looking at the balloons. So we did, there were some more pieces I was involved in with Postcommodity after this project. You go to the next slide. This is a photograph from the DAPL water protection that happened in 2016 around in Standing Rock tribal lands, Standing Rock Reservation. And this photo is of water protectors up on a hill being called upon by the police who have this tank. And if you're able to see what is located on top of this tank, you see a device, a square speaker called an LRAD. LRAD stands for Long Range Acoustic Device. And so I was researching these weapons for a Postcommodity sound installation that we ended up doing at Documenta 14. I'm not going to talk about that piece, but one of the parts of my research was seeing how these were being used onto people. And they've been used at the G20 summit. They were used at Occupy Wall Street, onto protesters, and evidently were also at Standing Rock. Even before this photo was taken, which was near the end of the water protection, there were reports of the police and private security using sonic weapons on water protectors. And that, combined with just what I felt was an obligation as an Indigenous person in the United States to go to Standing Rock and find out what was happening. What I was hearing reports on social media and on the regular media from friends saying all kinds of things were happening, and I couldn't really untangle what that was. And I was fortunate enough that my friend Cannupa, who's going to talk very soon, is from this community, from those lands, and was making trips back and forth, and invited me to accompany him up there. And I, of course, jumped at the opportunity just to understand, what was happening, and do what I could, at least as a presence, to be there and try to understand. Also, as a visitor to there, trying to understand what the land was saying, what the needs of the land were, and try to find out from the people who had stewarded the place, who have stewarded Standing Rock, what those needs were as well. And so I was up there with Cannupa for, I think, like a week and a half, and it was quite a profound experience. Years later, I was trying to transcribe what I experienced. And if you go to the next slide, I made a score out of these thoughts. I remember on the way back, Cannupa and I were talking about all of the dynamics of what we encountered there and how this might result in some kind of organization of the future. You know, these Standing Rock was one of many land protections that we hope will exist into the future. And so in sharing these ideas with my wife, curator Candace Hopkins, we came up with a score called Dispatch. And so I brought this today to share briefly. This is available online through a sound art organization called Liquid Architecture. If you go to the next slide. What Dispatch is, I'll describe. It's either a transcription of events around the 2016 DAPL encroachment at Standing Rock, or it's a prompt for an ecological oral future, or at the very least, is a critique of the privilege of meditative deep listening. This score can be realized as a performance or as a series of imagined events. It can also be enacted in the real world. The players, the prompts, and the schematics are derived from an analysis of the surface dynamics and organization of the water protectors in defense of Standing Rock during the No DAPL movement, not glossing over the miscommunication, profiteering, and injustices. In an increasingly fractured society, new paths and new formations are needed to refocus our attention in an attempt to find truth. Participating in this score may produce sonic or visual artifacts. These are as important as the actions. And so it acts as a score that is both transcription or prescription, to prompt, to try to untangle dynamics of a situation, but also to create new possibilities, new alignments, new interactions. And so what you see here on this page is maybe what would be the instrumentation, the ensemble, the players, if you will. You have hosts, the people who are stewarding the land, spiritual leaders, frontline activists, militant indigenous people, undercover cops, helpers, witnesses, Burning Man people, who you Nevada folks are aware of, and artists, gatekeepers, all kinds of folks one might encounter in these situations. Next slide. And a series of prompts, considering what can you do when you're there. You can arrive there. Even if you're not there, you should arrive there. You can do nothing. You can listen. You should sustain yourself. You could rebroadcast. You can create small gatherings. You can teach. You can learn. You can pray. You can cook. You can sing. You can witness. You should always witness. You can translate and continue to the next, I believe it's a schematic. These are some ways that I took upon to transcribe the different ways that you can perhaps relay a message of the land. This message of the land goes to an elder, to a host, to a knowledge keeper, and could be repeated, could be relayed. It could be multiple people saying this message. The message can always be louder. The message can always be longer. Perhaps a message when it can be said in a different way, or it can be understood in a different way when it changes who says it. Maybe a woman should say it. Maybe a young person should say it sometimes. And to the next schematic. And what can you do next? You know, you can amplify the call. You can gather the players. There might be other sites to transfer this knowledge onto. And maybe you try to maintain that place after you leave. We had so many people coming through Standing Rock. My question today, and maybe Cannupa knows more about this, is, you know, what's there now? You know, what was left after all those people, you know, had left that site, had felt that they had done what they could do, or who were evicted? You know, was there still work to be done in that site? And of course, yes, there was. And continue. And this is a way to try to, of course, make all of this come back to the site, be in benefit to the land. And so I have 3 more slides. I'm going to just talk about them briefly, but maybe there's more questions afterwards. And maybe Cannupa has some words about this as well. Cannupa and I ended up collaborating after that in a very large work. I mean, this work probably took more time than Repellent Fence, was a piece called Standing Rock. And what Sweetland is an opera that is composed by myself and a composer, Duyan, and was written in collaboration with librettist Douglas Kearney and Aja Kushwa Duncan. Aja Kushwa Duncan is Ojibwe. And this opera was directed by Cannupa and Yuval Sharon. Yuval Sharon is known for making these very experimental, elaborate, complicated operas in Los Angeles. And let me go to the next slide. Let me read a bit about what I have about Sweetland. Sweetland is a manifest destiny opera that erases itself as you watch it. It's actually 2 separate operas performed in real time alongside each other, telling multiple narratives. Some of these being the building of the railroad out of bones, a feast turned into a forced marriage, and the ruins of the Tongva village and the site of the Chinatown massacre in downtown Los Angeles, where we built the stages and where this was performed right up until COVID shut down half of the run. And so this is a project we're hoping will have another life after lockdown, and was very much an opportunity for Indigenous voices to talk about the encounters that have happened in the United States history, the history of not only the East Coast tribes encountering that colonization, but also the Southwest with the Spanish, California as well, and trying to turn this into an opportunity not for historical narrative, but also trying to more untangle the myths around the United States history. Of course, none of this can be done without referencing the land. And that's what I feel was accomplished within Sweetland, was bringing attention to the land itself of where we were staging the piece. And so thank you for listening. I'm going to hand it over to Cannupa. And again, thank you, Nevada Museum of Art.
Well, Dosha Maragua, Dishkag Nuhudosha, Nitwe Hudosham, Cannupa Hanska Luger, Nueta, Sanish, and Arikara. I'm Awachet, Dripping Earth Clan out of North Dakota. I'm from the upper Missouri River area, and grew up kind of as a river person. My father's side of the family is Lakota, and I was born in Standing Rock, a small town called Fort Yates, North Dakota. It juts out into the Missouri River, and yeah, so the Raven had mentioned when we first met, it was on an auspicious time in U.S. history, not unfamiliar, but sustained, which was the engagement at Oceti-Chacon Standing Rock Reservation with the Dakota Access Pipeline running oil across our river, all of our river. And I think when we went up together, I had just come up with this form, this design. You can go to the next slide and I can reference the mirror shields. This is the project that Nevada Art Museum or Nevada has as a part of their collection, is this project that was called the Mirror Shield Project. And I have a strange relationship with this project as it was built out of necessity. I had a hard time really even comprehending it as art until, once again, necessity forced my hand to make it art. What you're seeing right now is a test run of a engagement with all of these shields that we brought to Oceti-Chacon. a friend of mine, as we were doing this project, and as we rolled up with Raven, a friend of mine who I went to school with, his name is Rory Wakemup, wanted to bring me out to Minneapolis to do a talk around Standing Rock and kind of rally folks and engage folks. And just before then, you know, I was on social media watching the police in North Dakota spraying the water protectors with hoses in October in North Dakota, which is about as violent as you can get with non-lethal force. And I wanted to make something that kind of like created a barrier, created a shield between those who were standing to protect the water and those who were defending the pipeline. There's an interesting kind of conversation around all of that, which is this was described through most media outlets as a protest, that they were protesting oil. But the vast majority of the folks who were engaging here were not necessarily protesting oil. They were trying to protect water. And that's a completely different conversation. The benefit of calling it a protest is that you can respond with the force that you deem necessary. By making this engagement a collection of protesters, you can justify them being in opposition. If they're in opposition, that justifies the violence that was kind of projected onto all of these folks. But I just wanted to take it back to the, you know, idea of this project really came out of a bunch of influences throughout history. The application of a mirrored shield, facing monsters, facing enemies, and then also facing ourselves like a mirror. There was something in that I thought was really important, especially as we were trying to protect water. What we were facing were, you know, hyper-militarized police, security, private security firms, and then also the National Guard, so the nation itself. And we were trying to protect water for everybody. And so I thought it would be important to create a shield and a line that actually put our opposition on our front line, reflected them back at themselves, so they could see themselves and also acknowledge and realize that we're not selfishly protecting water, we're protecting water for everybody, you included. You're on our side, kind of is the idea that this project kind of made manifest. And the performance of the pieces was really because at the time the the state was under really weird God, what do they call that? There's a term that allows the government to change laws and do all sorts of crazy stuff. I can't think of it. Martial law. There, because they deemed this protest like a natural disaster, and responded with the National Guard coming in to respond to all of that. And by doing so, they were also allowed to create checkpoints and close entry into Standing Rock Reservation. And I had come up to Minneapolis to do a project with Rory Rory Wakemup, and he ended up gathering his community. They ended up building like 500 of these shields. And so instead of doing a talk in Minneapolis, we decided that I was like, oh, I know how to get into Standing Rock. I'm from there. There's so many easement roads. And we drove these all in, but they were doing all of these checkpoints because they were afraid that there were going to be weapons on the camp. And so we decided to make an art piece out of it. Like, we thought, if these aren't shields, if these aren't weapons, or these are components to an art project, we could find our way in without having to justify their application. I bring all of that up because I think what we ended up doing was creating a human river, acknowledging the fact that water's first lesson is sharing. And that's a relationship that human beings and waters have had forever. That's one of the first lessons water has taught any living thing, is that it's for sharing. And so we thought we could create a river of people flowing throughout the camp, using these shields above their heads to reflect. And our audience was literally the police that were surveilling the camps. We documented a test run, but the actual art project came out and was presented specifically for the police, for the National Guard, for the private security firms that were flying planes and helicopters and surveillance drones over the top of the camps. I think there was something in that that acknowledges this idea of land art through a different perspective. And I think we can go on to the video now, and I'll just talk in over some of these ideas. I wanted to bring all of this up because this sort of there's like a different relationship to the land that I think was important, and something that I think Nevada recognized that Indigenous people had known from time immemorial. And they've known it because they haven't completely separated themselves from the land. They acknowledge themselves as an extension of it. We acknowledge ourselves as an extension of it. And in my practice, I strive to inform an audience that has sustained this myth of being separate from the earth, separate from the land, separate from any other animal or living thing. And I feel like a lot of our present political and social and economic disparities is based on this dislocation, this removal, this isolation that is perceived, that you are separate. You can play the video, and I'm just going to talk over it. In the video, what you will see is just some projects that I've been working on, and I'm just reinforcing some of these ideas as we see through this. I'm very fascinated and interested in water, and learning more so about its relationship, how water is, it has these really sophisticated routes to transfer rain in the mountains to the sea at the far edge of our lands. That it's infrastructure designed through patience and observation, giving the water itself agency. We acknowledge our own agency as intellectual beings, but we're mostly water. And I think that there is something in acknowledging that transfer and that share of ideas, being an extension of the land. How do you not make land art, is the larger question that I think. With that as a model, like if you are an extension of your environment and you're not an imposition of a human hand or thought or idea laid out on top of the land, if you're not convinced that you have dominance over it, that you can command it, if you acknowledge that you're only a fingernail growing on the body that is the land, how does anything that you make not reinforce this relationship and this kinship and this dependency on our environment? And I think that that's something that we need to acknowledge as we move forward, and even opening up the conversation of land art, celebrating, masters through a Western lens of creating these kind of symbols etched onto the environment, I think is a wonderful way to emphasize our completely different kind of ideas around what it means to belong. And at what point did we sever our sense of belonging and in turn betrayed the idea that we must have belongings, that it must belong to us, that we can't belong to it. I think as Indigenous people, we have a lot of protocols and cultural practices that reinforce a lot of these ideas. We might not even know that because we've maintained this practice. We've never severed ourselves in ways. I bring all of this up because in my practice, I'm oftentimes collaborating In fact, I believe I've never done anything alone, really. The video you're seeing here is a piece that's literally called Belonging, and it was around. It was commissioned and designed in an exhibition that was looking at species disappearing in our present time, and that being kind of a larger impact on the human experience in the world than even climate change. That climate change is a component that's adding to species disappearing from the environment, but that the impact of species disappearing would create these gaps and holes in the network that is living things on this planet, and that we would see the effects of that far sooner than we would see the effects of global warming impacting us as a living thing. And so I wanted to talk about buffalo being removed from the land. I'm from North Dakota. I am from tribes that were buffalo people, that we were dependent on the buffalo, and we acknowledge the buffalo as not a resource, but a nation, a whole and separate and also informed nation that actually gave us inspiration, ideas through patience and observation. We witnessed this nation thrive on the lands that we also lived on, and followed their routes. We learned what food was good for us to eat, what food we needed to sustain and prepare for them to eat so that we could eat them. And there was an acknowledgement of this interlacing experience that is the living thing connection on this planet. And I think as we look into land art, as we look into our histories around what it means to be a part of something much larger than your own self, I don't know how to bypass any of that kind of conversation at present. And so I've been doing a lot of work looking at Indigenous futurism and ideas of presenting some of our ancestral knowledge, some of our technologies that were deemed primitive upon contact, but then in turn became inspiration for green economies in our present. There's no acknowledgement of Indigenous contribution to that sort of information, which keeps us from recognizing our contribution to our kind of I guess present contribution to popular culture. And by not seeing ourselves making that contribution, it's hard to see ourselves outside of the museums that place us in dark spaces, in dimly lit rooms, and talk about our cultures and our practices in the past tense. I believe in our survival, and I believe through having to navigate a world that forces us to survive, that forces us to exist in a state of crisis, we have been able to adapt to completely radical changes. And in that adaptation, there's so much information and so much knowledge that could be shared if people are willing to listen. And I think as an artist, I have a certain degree of privilege and access that maybe folks from my community don't. And I'm really interested in how we share ideas, collaborating with one another, amplifying voice, and building bridges from one cultural sense. These are like mental bridges from one community to the next, and allow them to interact. And I think that's what, art based as communication, but also, even referencing some of Raven's work, the dispatch piece is, is an analog or is a composition that informs that relationship of land acknowledgement, not as a written statement that justifies previous settling for current settling, but rather acknowledging the land itself as an agent, as having its own purpose and information, and that information could be transmitted and shared to inform people on how to exist in the place that they are, to reinforce what it means to belong and not what it means to have belongings. So a lot of the work that I do are physical objects, but I'm interested in how we see the land from different perspectives, and I utilize new media, new materials to gain new perspective, but to reinforce customary ideas, ideas that I think, as green economies bloom and blossom in the desert of our kind of present economic models and social models, as we grasp for sustainability and existing sustainable on the planet, there's tens of thousands of years of applied science that's embedded in indigenous cosmology. And it takes an effort to transcribe that sort of information, and it can't be any one individual. I respect Raven's work because he comes at, I think we're addressing very similar conversations, but through completely different lenses, completely different cultural experiences and mediums. And because of that multiplicity of presentation, I think it opens up a possibility to actually, if not reach dominant culture, reach our own people, reach our own communities, and allow them to see us contributing to popular culture in a way that is both futuristic and ancient. I think with that, I'm happy to dive into a conversation with you all. I would much rather speak with you than at you. And I appreciate the opportunity to present these ideas and this work in the context of the Nevada art and the land art exhibition and all of that. So, thank you. I'm excited to talk with Raven and everybody else. So thank you very much.
Well, Raven and Cannupa, thank you very much for great presentations that I hope will jumpstart some conversations. There's a lot of questions in here in the Q&A. One I want to just hit on really quickly because it's kind of a more technical question about Cannupa's presentation. Emily Jane Curran was asking, may I ask where that site is on screen now, seen from an aerial view? Is it a university or a public building? And it was right at the moment where there was this circular form.
That's the Institute of American Indian Arts here in New Mexico. It's the university that I went to for my undergrad and the extension of my collegiate education, Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico.
Thanks for that. I think I'll start with a couple of questions from the education cohort that maybe both of you can address. Very similar approaches they ask to the mirror shield and to Raven's work. Both works are a reflection of the natural, and technological strategies and physical properties that create land art and employ the land as a collaborator, which Cannupa, you did talk about, versus something to be seen or to act in response to the Western contemporary land art tradition. Can you both speak to this?
I can hold up a mirror. Yeah, I think it's interesting. That whole canon of kind of Western land art experience absolutely reinforces a lot of colonial ideas and concepts that we as an incredibly adaptable species must transform the land in order for it to fit our necessity, rather than figuring out how to transform our adaptable selves to a land that has through millions of years generated the best way to be, you know. So it's an imposition of human idea. I'm always intrigued that there's something kind of like, there's something more expansive when you can utilize the land's information itself and transmit that as a presentation or an idea of what it means to make land art versus the opposition of that. It seems like you're engaging with something far more intelligent than yourself, you know. So that's, I don't know if that answers your question at all. Maybe Raven picked it up where I didn't.
I mean, yeah, for me, it just kind of came about for practical reasons. I mean, early on, making sound and putting on experimental music concerts out here in New Mexico, we just had to go do it out in the desert anyway with generators. You know, I didn't really have a space to do this at. And so that was one part of what maybe influenced the later work that I did. But another part of it was kind of a funny thing I always talk about, studying recording, and you know, there was always this emphasis on treating the room or the room sound, or you know, putting baffles up. And I started thinking, why not just bypass all that and just, you know, record outside, you know, perform outside, make sound outside, and get it out of this building, you know, that's already encroaching in this spot and has its own formality to it, you know, the concert hall. And so that was another solution that you know, was just, let's just do it outside, and any of the other things that are happening outside would be part of the music. I guess kind of a John Cage thing, even though it's not what I'm going after. And then obviously once you do that, or once you get invited to do that other places, well, you have to respond to that land. You have to respond to the history of that place. And so it was never about making something in the studio and then taking it other places. A lot of those times, especially with the work of Postcommodity, what we were doing was we would get an invitation and then feel an obligation to learn about, you know, research and learn about the place that we're being invited to.
So many questions coming in here. I want to make sure we get to them. So Julian Myers-Shapinska says, thank you for these inspiring presentations. Could either of you talk about the American desert in terms of otherness, openness, loss of individuality, mirage, dream images, and sensory overload? These are aspects of the desert experience that wind through the trippier edges of the 1960s land art practices, and they seem as if they may be important to some of your works too.
I don't know how to respond to that. Loss of individuality, they try to kill us. The federal government try to kill us. I mean, that's a loss of individuality right there. Otherness, same thing. I mean, obviously we're the others. I don't actually know how to respond to this.
Yeah, I don't really either. I think a lot of that like 1960s, 70s trippy kind of entanglement is in response to what I was talking about earlier, which is this like displacement, you know, this removal of self from environment. I think the application of like psychedelics in desert, kind of like archetypical motifs that you see through like a lot of Western kind of presentation of work is that kind of like medicated forced effort to reimagine what it means to belong to a place. And it's so foreign to a Western lens that it needs to be engaged with through some sort of psychotropic experience. But that there is that actually undermines what it means to be present and to be in place and to be inspired by the environment. You don't have to augment your reality in order to experience the land in a way that is whole, you know? And I think that Indigenous people just have a completely different relationship to place, especially here, especially in places where they haven't been completely removed from them. We've been displaced. We've been moved to different areas. We were forced to encroach on other tribal communities spaces. All of these things are kind of like collateral effects of a much larger conversation. And as Indigenous people, like, you know, we have traditions, we have customs from various places that use psychotropic plant medicine for information, but it's not for the trip, you know. It's for reestablishing this like connection to spirit within that place. But that's also not a part of my culture, so I can't like overlap all of these sorts of things. Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. It's an interesting question, but I don't have the answer for that one either.
We've got a question, I think primarily for Raven, but from Emily Eliza Scott. So the first question, I guess, for both of you, how can we stay tuned to see sweet land in the future? But secondly, we'll get back to that. And this is kind of long. She has a brilliant graduate student of hers, Bailey Hilgren, who's been doing work on sonic conflicts and colonization, specifically looking at the boundary waters in Minnesota and the way that silence has been imposed as an ethic, but also legally in the name of wilderness protection, blocking, for instance, traditional subsistence hunting and gathering via motorboat. At a couple of points, you critiqued meditative deep listening, a practice that has become a staple of a certain kind of white, wilderness-oriented American environmentalism. Can you say more about your thoughts on the problem of the myth of silence and the related practice of meditative deep listening?
Yeah. Well, first of all, just on Sweetland, it's available online. We were fortunate to document the final performance, and one can see a video version of that, which you know, coincidentally aligned with lockdown. But hopefully this will be staged again in the future, not necessarily in Los Angeles. We feel it's adaptable to other American cities. So keep a lookout for that through the Industry Opera Company. And yeah, I mean, this idea of the critique of the meditative deep listening, I mean, it might go to Julian's question too, or part of that answer to that is that this is my home, this is my homeland, and that continues to be an encroachment of coming here for some kind of, you know, getaway, you know, some kind of tourist activity, much like we saw, like when I said it happened at Standing Rock, people going over and thinking it was going to be some kind of party or something. You had that element to that as well. But what I find interesting in the question too is this this kind of I don't know about this via motorboat encroachment of interrupting hunting or anything like that, but you do have this battle that's happening of sound. You know, who can speak, who can be broadcast, what is the sonic encroachments we have in these territories as well, you know, construction, even who gets their voices heard amongst this, you know, whose stories get told. And so that's been some of my work, is just getting around these, I think, expectations that an Indigenous composer is going to be making, you know, some kind of response to the land. It's not necessarily that kind of work that I'm doing. I mean, Cannupa will share with you, we've had a lot of discussions too about tribal traditions of telling the story of the land, you know, song lines of landscapes and horizon lines. All of that is a whole nother kind of way to talk about, you know, landscape. But there's an expectation sometimes that I'm making work that is going to, I don't know, you're going to hear the birds and the deer frolic through whatever. It's not that kind of work. It's a lot of times it is addressing violence, history, industrialization, or listening, or our own encroachment, even Indigenous people's encroachment in this, you know, what our positions are.
I think we've unpacked a lot of this dialogue, and as Cannupa likes to say, untangled, you know, where does this work fall within different genres? How do we receive this as audience? I think I kind of want to end with a question from the educators. I have to say there's so many questions from this K-12 group that we can't get to them all, but I'm excited to see them all. And I think one is a little less cerebral, and maybe both of you can address it. Just as we grow in technology in the future, our youth are becoming less connected to the natural environment. What message would you like to share with them?
I would like to define technology, and actually, like, let's come to terms on what that means. You know, what technology means. Presently, when I think of technology, I think of Silicon Valley. I think of the internet, the application of, cell towers and satellites transmitting ideas. I think about smart cars and all of this sort of stuff, things that we would deem the tech industry. But technology is not a mechanism. Technology is an idea. So the original idea, the thing that people are concerned about is a mechanism reshaping an old technology. Communication is primarily what our technology is bolstering at this point. It's a capacity to communicate. So I encourage folks to consider that a bird's song is no different than the latest iPhone as far as technology goes. The mechanism amplifies that in a completely different way. But the original knowledge, the original transmission of one idea transmitted from one individual to the next is still in place and still in play and still important. We have the capacity to communicate to people and cultures around the globe at this point with minimal effort. How do we understand that as the greatest resource rather than like it being a economic point, you know? I would consider and I charge that future generation the responsibility of decoding what we consider technology presently and utilize it to reinforce a more equitable and a more sustainable future. Maybe it will make itself obsolete as we are able to share better ideas with one another outside of these kind of siloed spaces of power and control. Those siloed spaces of power and control kind of informed us and allotted us access to communicate on ways that I don't know if they really comprehended the scale and the scope at which that is. And I would just say, don't drown in in what it gives, but understand that it amplifies in ways that allows you access to escape those very same silos that permitted the technological kind of advancements. Consider that, and I need you to, because I have children in the future. I get to die trying to imagine the space that I would like to believe our future exists in, but I don't get to live in it, and you may. So I encourage you to figure out how to hurdle that.
Raven, do you have anything you'd like to add?
What's the question again on this?
It was, as technology advances and youth become more disconnected from the environment, what is your hope for their engagement? What is your hope for the future generations?
I mean, it's very practically, it is reconnecting with those traditions and language also being a technology. I mean, reconnecting with that is probably the priority right now for a lot of Indigenous people, you know, retaining that language. But I don't know, at the same, I have a funny relationship with technology. I like bass clarinets, you know. I don't think there can be a better bass clarinet. I don't like running that through a max patch. I think there's still a lot for me to learn from the bass clarinet. So I don't know. I'm not a huge cynic on technology yet. I'm still figuring some things out with that. But I think that young people should have access to these things, including a bass clarinet. And you know, there's hope in that for me.
Yeah, and I would say also, you're only as disconnected as you can imagine. That idea of disconnection is literally just that. It's a construct and it's an idea. We separate ourselves through our language and how we place ourselves in relationship to our environment and our space. But we have yet to truly separate ourselves from the land. There's like a handful of folks who've reached the edges of our gravitational pull. But beyond that, we are an extension of our environment. You can't escape that. You are a living thing. You are one of the living things, you know, on this planet. And the more you reinforce the idea that you're separate, the more separate you become. But you can do the same in the opposite direction. You can acknowledge the necessity of being a part of place, and then act accordingly. You know, there are protocols that are in place in cultures across the globe, cultures that were informed by the environments that created those cultures. Our lives have always been adapting to the place that we exist in. How do we acknowledge that and give that kind of precedent over our separation and our isolation from it? I think that's one of the biggest concerns as far as youth into the future, is the feeling more and more isolated as you become more and more capable of communicating with people from different places. Try not to isolate yourself in that.
I think with that, we'll probably sign off for today. I just want to express to Raven and Cannupa the just sincere thanks. I cannot tell you how many people are commenting in our Q&A and our chats here on our virtual platform, thanking you for your presentation, sending greetings from wherever they are across the world. I just want to make sure that both of you realize how appreciated your comments are as a part of this, this series of conversations that we've been hosting. So thank you, both of you. And for all of our subscribers who are with us, the next communique you'll be receiving from us is actually in a written form. It'll be an exit interview between by Andrea Zattel and Brooke Hodge related to high desert test sites. So watch for that to come to you. And then our next talk will be on November 12th at 11 a.m. Emily Eliza Scott and Suzanne Betker, Land Art's Evolving Relationship to Environmentalism. So again, Cannupa and Raven, thanks to both of you so much, and we look forward to seeing everyone else very soon.